These will probably start like 5 or so minutes. 5:30 now, you're gonna wait till 5. I'm gonna do well.
Up, Doc.
Yeah. Et cetera. And then. You got it.
No.
I just want to be very focused living here. Let me know if you want to do it. I totally can. I'm only saving this for one of my friends. Send it out to citizens of this town. Yeah, just a few more minutes.
Yeah. Yes.
What were they talking?
Maybe it just didn't get good reception with this. There are systems when you can do that. I have hearing aid.
Yeah.
Okay, you minute. Get it move on. Get it over to Steve. Steve, we'll get it all. Been running around all day then. What now? We are streaming. Okay.
Test. Doesn't sound test. Testing. Testing.
These are hot. I'm gonna go first.
I'm holding a rhetorical grenade.
And all right. All right, everybody, good evening and welcome to our quarterly town hall series. We appreciate you being here tonight as always. We are going to have a panel this evening led by our scholar, Paul Evans, who is here tonight as his capacity as an educator. But until we get started, just a few housekeeping things. Restrooms are in the very back right there. Please help yourself throughout this meeting. Tea and coffee, soda, any of the food items. Please help yourself to those. If you find that there's trouble hearing in here, we have devices called hearing loops. One of our city councilors is wearing one right now. I'll probably be wearing one as well. I'll get one for you, Councilor Oberst. So if you do find the noise in here is a little bit hard to hear through, please let me know and I'll get you one of those hearing loops. And now I'd like to introduce the mayor of Monmouth, C. Scoots.
Good evening, and I echo Sabra's welcome. We're really pleased to have you here this evening, and we've had the quarterly halls. We've talked about topics like city services, other things in the community going on, budget issues, and tonight we decided we wanted to take on a topic a little bit more that potentially we hope to have more questions from you than we do have a presentation for you. And that is because a topic that has come up recently and even more recently nationally, but here in our community, and we really want to talk about Monmouth and issues of the First Amendment, of freedom of speech, of freedom of assembly, and how we look at those things when we have concerns, because we have had concerns, we have had complaints, and we have had incidents. And so we really want to hear your questions and thoughts, but I want to have you first hear a little bit from some of the folks who might get called if there are concerns and questions. And I'm going to first introduce this evening, Paul Evans is going to be a moderator, so he'll be calling on you if you have questions. He is a professor of rhetoric. So a little bit about how we use speech and how speech has traditionally been viewed in our country. And then tonight, introducing our attorney, Justin Thorpe is our city attorney. And Justin, if you've watched city council meetings or attended, has stepped into the seat previously held by Lane Shetterly. So Justin is our current city attorney, and he will talk to you a little bit from that perspective. We also have our police chief, Isaiah Haynes, who has been on our force his entire career after he graduated from Western Oregon University. So he is a longtime member of our community, as well as our chief. And tonight we also invited our Polk County District Attorney. Aaron Felton is the person who, if we enforce laws, we count on him to manage the prosecutorial side, and he works with our county. So we really want to hear from him as well about maybe issues that arise in our county, things that maybe we are or aren't familiar with, and get a little bit of his perspective too. So I am going to turn it over to these guys and start with Paul Evans, if you want to start us off tonight. And then we'll leave plenty of time for questions.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the governor for redress of grievances. A lot of people think the First Amendment allows you to say anything you want, and it actually doesn't. It does allow you to say a whole lot of things, and most of the things you want. In simplest terms, if you want to understand the difference between what is and isn't protected by the First Amendment, you have the right and the privilege, and by golly, the moxie, if you wish, to be an idiot. But you can't be an inciter of violence. That was the standard laid by the Supreme Court, and that's generally the standard seen as the dividing line between when people engage and when people don't engage. And I want to draw that very carefully. It comes out of our system of government, and they am part teacher and part lawmaker, and then I'm going to hand it over to the folks that unfortunately have to enforce the things we pass. But the United States was passed into existence at a particular moment in human history that probably won't ever come around again and probably was unexpected when it did. It came at the exact moment where people pushed back on what they'd been pushing back on. So what does that mean? It means this. For 1,000 years, basically boiled down, for 1,000 years, we knew everything we knew on Western civilization because sacred text told us. And then we found out through a number of different things, like how planets operate around a sun and how gravity works, that, oh my goodness, everything that is in the sacred text isn't right. So we basically went 180 that way because humans are just so good at, moderation. So after that, in the middle of, or at least the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, people started to recognize that, wait a minute, there's a role for both faith and for intelligence and thinking and knowledge. And it basically became upon an opportunity of folks who were frustrated with the governance that they had in the colonies. The learned folks who'd been following all this, they basically said, all right, wait a minute, we're going to establish a government that isn't founded upon faith, but also doesn't reject it. It recognizes the importance of knowledge, and it creates an establishment where people of different interests can live and adjust when we learn new things. And oh, by the way, we're going to figure it out and find a way to provide opportunities and freedoms for people. And then Jefferson gave us what I happen to believe is either the most magnificent piece of writing in Western civilization, or perhaps the biggest joke ever played on humans, where he said, life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness is everybody's right. The life metaphor and the liberty metaphor cannot coexist. When you have full expression of liberty, you by definition are actually impinging on other people's lives. And when you have life metaphor, you're actually impinging on people's freedoms of liberty. For example, let's look at a cigarette. For many, a cigarette is a symbol of death. And yet for others, the ability to smoke a cigarette because you choose to smoke a cigarette, if that isn't liberty, what is? We live in a country where we have very different ideas about what is right and what is wrong, what should be legal and what shouldn't be legal. And going back to the Declaration of Independence and our understanding of free speech enshrined in our very First Amendment to the Constitution, which again was pressed and put in place because the states were nervous about federal government having too much power. Sound familiar? Added to that, in Oregon, just to set the context, we are not only the inheritors of the first revolution that tried to have a place for both faith and knowledge, which the American Revolution was, but we're actually the heirs, the inheritors of a tradition that basically can go back to New England. Society got too complex, people got fed up, and they moved out to the Midwest. And when people got too upset about society being too busy and too many noise and too many people wanting different things, they just decided to get in wagons and they moved out west. And they moved into places like the Willamette Valley. And then when people in the Willamette Valley got upset, they moved to, well, they couldn't because there's an ocean. Our political culture is distinct. We have, if you go back to our very history, it is a composite of two very real things that we see in every debate, even today. The first is we are very, very culturally concerned about the tyranny of the crown. We do not want government to be too effective. We do not want government to have too much power. We do not want government to tell us what color of shed we can have in our backyard. We don't want government telling us we can go hunting or fishing, by golly, when we want to go hunting or fishing. We don't want government to tell us what church we have to go to, if at all. And at the same time, we also come from people who believe that there were rights and wrongs that were more important than just law, that basic respect to human beings is important, that when you choose to live in community, you're choosing a balance between your individual rights and community rights. And there's a natural tension between how do we have government be effective and at the same time be efficient. Oregon has more special districts per person than any other place on the planet. We have more special districts in the state of Oregon than most states can ever imagine. We have police districts in some places, fire districts, cemetery districts, library districts, school districts. In other parts of the country, that isn't that common. And the reason we have that is because we don't want any one government having too much power. And yet at the same time, why are we wasting so much tax dollars on so many different agendas? Put simply, Americans, and Oregonians in specific, are conflicted. And the way we're supposed to figure it out, the way we're supposed to live up to our duty in terms of living in a nation that is diverse, that claims to be open to new ideas, and again, is the largest attempted republic in the world. And by that is you can go to Russia and live there for your whole life, but you're never going to be Russian. You can go to China and live there your whole life. You're never going to be Chinese. In America, all you have to do is wait a couple generations and you'll be just as mad as the person on the bar stool next to you about what this latest group of immigrants are getting. It's America. It's in our DNA. If you work hard, play by the rules, eventually you'll become American. That's why it's critical at this time in American history that we recognize that we're going through natural tension. And the laws that we have to protect the rights of people give you the right to say everything you want to say so far as it doesn't actually incite violence. Put another way, you have the right to say whatever you want, but that doesn't mean you're going to get everything you want. Democracy isn't Burger King. Democracy is a cafeteria system. Some days you get more choices than others, but you don't get everything you want. And the problem is when people start promising you get everything you want, it not only discounts the value of other people's ideas, but it also starts to create expectations that are unfulfillable. And that's where I think we are today, and I'm going to hand it off in just a second. Civics is the recipe for a democratic republic that can continue. Understanding how your government works so you can effectively advocate, so you can stand up for what you believe in, so you can push ideas into concepts, into proposals, into laws, and then into implementation. There is a time for violence. But in American history and in Western civilization, violence is only accepted after several different steps have actually been taken place, and all of them require that you first petition, that then you give government an opportunity to fix what's broken. That, oh, by the way, if you're ever going to suggest violence, the masses have to agree with you because you're reflecting the mass and the mass concern. We live in an era where people suggest violence right out of the get. Violence stops the conversation. It doesn't enhance it. It doesn't promote it. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Civics is obviously the topic of tonight. I hope I didn't get too far and bore people. I'm going to pass it off to the lawyer.
Thank you. I'm Justin Thorpe. I'm the city attorney for the city of Monmouth. And rather than trying to summarize free speech law, I'm just going to hit on a couple of topics, things that I look for when I'm being asked to review like a regulation or an enforcement action, kind of free speech issues that can come up. One of the biggest red flags, if I'm evaluating something, is the regulation or is the enforcement, is it based on viewpoint? Is the city's action going to penalize or regulate some viewpoints differently than other viewpoints? And a viewpoint restriction would be, to give kind of a silly example, as if we allowed Oregon State logos in the building, but not University of Oregon logos. If there's a viewpoint restriction in what's happening, or it looks like there's an argument that it could be, that's almost always going to be a constitutional problem. A similar kind of restriction would be a content-based restriction. If I'm taking the same kind of silly example, if they just said you can't have any university logos in City Hall, that's not necessarily viewpoint based, but it's ruling out an entire category of content. That's not as bad as a viewpoint restriction from the First Amendment standpoint, but it's also often going to be a problem. Another issue that I look at is, where is this happening? Because depending on where you're talking about, there may be more or less free speech restrictions that would be reasonable. For example, a public sidewalk, that would be considered we call it a quote, traditional public forum. That's kind of the prime example of a place where pretty much anything goes from a speech standpoint. The free speech protections are at their broadest on a place like a public sidewalk. You compare that to City Hall. It's still a public building. It's a public space, but there's people trying to get their work done. So restrictions inside City Hall might be reasonable that would not necessarily be reasonable if they were on speech on a public sidewalk. Another issue I look at is, are we talking about expression at all? Is the regulation about expression, or is it about something else and the expression is just incidental to it? For example, burning an American flag is considered a form of expression. Supreme Court held that, kind of whether people agree with it or not, that's considered to be a type of expression. You go to a national forest in late September when there's a burn ban in effect and you burn an American flag and the rangers come up, you don't get to say, well, I was told by the city attorney of Monmouth that this is free expression protected by the first, because that's not what it's about. The burn ban isn't about expression at all. It's about a type of conduct. And if you're doing expression as part of that, that's not really getting into First Amendment territory. So those are some of the things I look for in kind of a broad sense. Where I come into this is when I'm basically being asked for advice about a regulation or enforcement, just from a legal standpoint. Not is this a good idea or a bad idea, but what kind of legal trouble could we get in? Those are some of the things that I look at. And I will now hand this off to the chief.
Evening. I'm Isaiah Haynes. I'm the chief of Monmouth. And as the mayor pointed out earlier, I've been here both as a student and now as a police officer for 20 years. And so I've got kind of my own unique perspective to things. But I'm glad that everyone's here today. I think this is an important topic. And as the mayor even referenced, this year alone, we've had a couple times that we've been asked to respond to assemblies or people speaking their viewpoints, in a public space. And our job is not, I'm not the judge. My officers are not the judge, but we are evaluators of what's happening. And it's an active role that we play. And first and foremost, what our main concern is that, that it's a safe environment, that people's safety is not in jeopardy. And that's what we're going to look at first. And then is it legal? Is this a lawful assembly, or is it not? Is there something more? As Representative Evans talked about, that is this insightful? Is this pointed? Is it repeated? There's certain things that we look at that we're constantly evaluating. Beyond that, I'm looking at tactically, how do we respond to this? Do we if everything is lawful and legal, we know that there's a lot of emotions, sometimes at these things. And so one of the things that I have to evaluate too is it appropriate at this time to put my officers as a referee to something that is lawful and legal, because we know that when things are tense, when they're emotionally charged, people don't always make the best decisions, and when I have, for example, two groups that maybe are in disagreement with viewpoints, and I put an officer in the middle of that, I've got one group saying, we want these people arrested or vice versa. And that is a tough situation to put our officers in. And I'm going to avoid that when I can, because I want our officers making the right choices. Now, as we're actively looking at these things, we're also going to make sure, again, if we have something that we think, hey, we've got a major safety issue here that we have to address, we're going to be there. sometimes, and that may even look like that we have officers in plain clothes that are observing from afar, or maybe, in today's day, there's technology that allows us at times to, observe through live streaming or social media or those kind of things. But we're going to be actively watching these events unfold, and our tactics and what we do will change throughout the course of those events. And so, if we get to a point, I'll just say that we think that we have something then that becomes unlawful, we will generally make that known and essentially give warnings, we'll say, and we'll say these are kind of the rules, and if you don't abide with these rules, you could be subject to arrest. Before we actually just rush in there, we're trying to be unbiased, not let our own viewpoints come into this. And if we get to a point where we feel like we have something that is again unlawful, it depends on what it is. But if we have the time and the ability, we may consult with the person that I will give the mic to next, which is our district attorney, and make sure that we're on solid ground before doing that. We don't always have that luxury as first responders, but typically when we do, we're gonna use that. So I'm sure that there will be some questions, and I welcome those. I think that sometimes I'm speaking in hypotheticals here, and there's a lot that's maybe not being said, but I hope that we have some questions because that'll be easier to answer specifics. I'll pass it off to DA Felton.
Hey, thank you, Chief. And I'm glad to be at a meeting where I'm the only one wearing a tie. How do I always do that? But thank you for the invitation. This is a really very timely topic, but it's always a timely topic to talk about the rights and freedoms that we have in this country, and compared, I think, to other countries in terms of our rights to speak out freely, our rights to be different than one another and be respected for that. And so I was very, very glad to get the mayor's invitation, and I'm glad to be here with this group. I've been district attorney in Polk County since 2013. I was the elected district attorney. I was a deputy DA before that. But I took a gap years to do a walkabout, and one of the things I did was be a deputy or an assistant city attorney in the city of Salem. So I think I'm very aware of some of the issues that your city attorney deals with, and I think that is some of the most challenging issues in terms of the First Amendment. Questions that come up is through really the civil side. The city attorney deals with groups who want to, can I post signs here? Can we do a parade here? Can we have a function here on public property? And really those near questions of time, place, and manner and content really go through the city attorney's office. We had many conversations in our office at the time about, can this group be here, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is really some of the liveliest conversations as compared to my office. And I'll tell you, I am not a constitutional scholar. I am not nearly as deeply read as Representative Evans is on these issues. I have a very narrow lane in these issues in working with Chief Haynes. It is, can I keep you safe? Can you do whatever it is that you're doing in terms of your right to express yourself under the First Amendment? Will you be safe? Will you be safe if you want nothing to do with what's going on and simply want to walk down the street, go to class, get home, and just be left alone? Are you going to be safe in that environment too? And yet are the people who are on the street, whether you're having a peaceful protest march, whether you're a street corner preacher, or whether you're just selling baked goods or whatever, you're out there and you can do your thing safely, peacefully, and be protected. And so that when I have conversations with Chief Haynes and we do, and we have conversations regularly, and I have conversations regularly with all of our law enforcement agencies. I remember one very well back when we had a lot of the activity around, I remember when the George Floyd incident happened, the tragedy around that happened. There was a lot of things that happened in Salem. Yet we knew that there might be some things happening in Dallas. Had a lot of sit downs with the chief in Dallas there about, we anticipate some activity at the courthouse. What should we do if? What do you think about that? So we talk regularly. Chief Haynes and his folks and I, we talk regularly, not only about specific incidents, but what may happen in the future. So even if we haven't had a talk about something that may be happening at Western tomorrow or something like that, they kind of know my feeling, my folks' feeling about it. So we know their feeling too, because one thing I'm not a tactical, a constitutional scholar. I'm not a tactical expert on defensive tactics or what law enforcement does necessarily. And I have great respect for the decisions that they make in terms of interacting with individuals in this community, which they know very, very well and have really good instincts about that. So I really defer to them about how we should approach this or that. But Representative Evans was absolutely correct. You just don't get to say whatever you want. Words have meaning, and you can be prosecuted for words. Here's a prime example. You can't call it 911 and say whatever you want, and say, "Oh no, that was my art. That's my performance." No, it's not. You can't call in a false report just based on your words. That's a crime. But it's all contextual. You can't get up into someone's face and threaten to do bodily harm to them, and say, "No, I'm just expressing myself. That's my First Amendment gig." No, it's not. It's all contextual. You can't call someone. The swatting thing, for example, have you ever heard of that? You can't just call up and say, "Hey, this is happening," and say it's just words. It has context. It has meaning. So mere expression. You've all heard the classic. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie house. It's not just words. As Representative Evans said, there are limits to what you can say. And my job and Chief Haynes is to kind of figure the context of what you're saying. Another classic example is when neo-Nazis marched down the streets of Skokie, Illinois. From my lane, and it's far more involved with the city attorney if that issue came through his office. But my lane is I'm not so involved in who's coming down there, but if that march, for example, offensive as it is to the community members, if they started getting out there or someone else started getting in and started beating people up, that's when I get involved or the police get involved. That's a very, very different matter. And the First Amendment boundaries change very much because those are crimes. Again, my role is to consider, is the First Amendment involved, but most of all, are there state crimes, harassment, disorderly conduct involved as well, and balance all those issues out? So that's kind of a different role I would play than, say, the city attorney would play. But yet the First Amendment, still very important, still respecting people's rights to peacefully protest, say their piece, preach on the street corner, paint what they want to paint, display their art, as long as it's not pornography. And again, I know subjective, but that's why we have judges, and there's a discretion involved with that. And I'm glad we do. As we all know, without citing examples, there are other countries out there where you don't have the same rights, and the government will react very differently if you want to just march down the street saying the rent's too high. So thank you for the opportunity. I'd love to have some questions.
So my job is to help get you the mic. You're asking the question. So anybody raise your hand, raise your paw. We're wolves. Which I would like the sticker thing. We don't need a U of O sticker. It's fine. Questions? Okay. What?
Okay.
Would the legal scholars address the issue at the corner of 99 and 51 when there are people jumping out with signs, distracting heavy truck, tankers, everything? Is that free speech? I looked at as an accident waiting to happen.
I'm going to kind of go back to some of the things I mentioned as kind of red flags or big issues for me. And one of the things you're bringing up is kind of speech versus conduct. If somebody ran into the street with a sign, that's no longer speech, that's conduct, because it's not about the sign, it's about running into the street at that point. given the location, we're talking about a public sidewalk. I am very careful before I tell the city that good to restrict that. One, location. Two, if it's an issue where there are sensitive viewpoints, if we're allowing people carrying one sign to do something, but then we don't like the sign that somebody else has, that's going to be a big problem. Now, there are all kinds of laws about traffic laws I haven't looked at our ordinances on that, probably state laws about having flashing lights or other things that constitute distractions. I think when I've looked into sign code issues, there may be some kind of traffic adjacent things there. If you have a big sign that's otherwise allowed, but it's put at a location that blocks a view around a corner, there are restrictions that can count for that, and that can address that. As a city attorney, I want to be real careful, though, that if we're regulating that, we're regulating that within, these are traffic restrictions. They have absolutely nothing to do with whether we agree or disagree with the signs that are being put up there, because, from a liability standpoint, it's easy to say, well, we were just looking at traffic stuff. But if there's any hint about, well, last month you let somebody else carry a different sign at the same intersection, that starts to be a problem. So,
Yeah, that's well put. And I would say from our perspective, I mean, we're always going to look at conduct, and the other part that we have to look at is the report we're getting that, this is what's happening on the corner there. There's people blocking traffic. Are we observing that? Do we have evidence that that actually is occurring and that we can make an arrest on that? Sometimes that doesn't always happen. We have to kind of discern and or see if, again, there's evidence that it's actually occurring, because not every report is accurate, So, but and this would apply to everybody. It doesn't matter if, to me, and as a first responder, if somebody is blocking traffic, it doesn't matter if they're doing it in they're assembling, and they have signs up and they're speaking their viewpoint on the corner, or if it's happening, right outside in front of, the market right now. That would be the crime of disorderly conduct and maybe some other things, but we would address that.
And the chief hit exactly where I was going on this. There are people out there who are doing marketing on street corners and with signs, with all these spinning signs and different things. They're out all day and they're doing that. And to me, it's distracting, but that's my personal opinion. But if they're going into the street, blocking traffic, that's disorderly conduct. But the question is, and that's where I default to the police. When they observe it, it's contextual. It's the degree. Are they doing it one time and maybe it happened? Is it 2 or 3 times and it's obvious? Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? That's where I rely upon a good trained law enforcement officer to observe it, document it, and then within their discretion to make a decision, does it meet the elements of disorderly conduct or not? And I rely upon them to make that judgment. If they think it is, they'll write it up and either arrest the person, cite them, and send it up to us to just make a decision to prosecute. So it depends on the context of what's happening out there. So I hate always giving you a lawyerly answer of it depends or maybe, but it could be a crime depending on what's happening there. And I don't care what the sign is, whether they're advertising for Carl's Jr., buy season tickets to the Ducks, or a political message. If they're in the street blocking traffic, it's potentially a crime.
There's an element to this also, and I don't believe this is the case with the incident you're talking about. But because of the advent of social media, there are now instances where groups intentionally go across that line. And I would suspect that when you're judging whether or not this is something you're going to intervene on, is the intent to block the sidewalk or to cause a scene that then gets a response, or is it they're doing the best they can to express themselves, not really intending to try to create that secondary or third effect? Because our politics at this moment in time has become much more polarized. This is where I think for anybody who sees themselves as an advocate, it's kind of one of those things where if you know, you're now responsible. As an advocate, you need to be aware of what the laws are. So you really work to make sure your folks, if you are trying to make an expression, aren't pushing the boundary on that. So that it doesn't become something you're not intending.
I apologize. I have great confidence in the diplomacy and the subtlety and the discretion of these police officers in diffusing and addressing that kind of situation. There are parallels. In the past, there have been political movements which have engaged in civil disobedience for a purpose. And I can talk about sit-ins, luncheon sit-ins and that sort of thing. That is not blocking traffic, risking harm to motorists and other folks like that. There's subtleties, there's differences, there's difference in the response. And I have the greatest regard for our law enforcement people in addressing those situations because there has been learning that has gone on from those situations in our law enforcement people since then.
What you're talking about is one or two people standing at Burgerville with their cheerleading squad from the high school raising money for for their squad versus 30 or 40 people sitting on the side with big signs in the way for traffic and the whole deal. Those are two totally different aspects of it in regards to sitting there with the spinning sign and all that stuff.
Mhm.
When you're talking about a traffic problem, just watch the news daily. There's 20, 30, 40 people gathering up in Portland, Salem, and all that, blocking traffic here, and it's getting there down here. And there's got to be something to be done about it because I know friends of mine that own businesses in town that have trucks and stuff like that, and it's a pain in the butt for them when they see it. It's an absolute ridiculous. I think we got to put that into context, the point of whether, or you got 30 people with signs and big, ridiculous signs up on the corner of the road. Both sides. Well, if we're talking size, Paul, we can that's blocking traffic for the general motorist down on that busy intersection right there.
Would the city say as a group that
would the city say as a group that if somebody or something is impeding a police officer, that is a violation?
I guess, can you tell me what you mean by impeding a police officer?
We're dancing around Minneapolis right now, and this whole place is. And I feel that there are people impeding officers' jobs that are legally doing things and they're impeding them, and the local police are not doing anything about it. What is the city's position in the same exact thing? Are you going to support other sworn officers, whether they're state, county, or U.S. government? Or do you have a position?
Well, I do, and I'll say, and I'm going to pass it off to the city attorney here in a second. There's a lot to unpack with what you said, and I think there's a lot of assumptions I'll make, but I'll just say that there are Oregon statutes that talk about interfering with a police officer. If they're doing a lawful investigation, there's an interfering statute that's state law, and so there are things that apply. When I think what you're probably referring to is you're talking about immigration and enforcement. And,
no, I'm not. I'm talking about the law.
Okay.
If there's a law broken, then is it your duty to stop that, enforce it? Or are there laws that you don't want to enforce or you're going to ignore?
No, I mean, there's always, again, whether it be a tactic or discretion, it really depends on the situation. But when it comes to certain things, for example, the statute I said of interfering, the way that that would apply, and it's most common, but if you have an officer that's responded to a certain call for service and they are making a lawful arrest, and there are certain things that they have to carry out to do that, and there are people physically, interfering with that, it's very likely that they're going to get arrested as well. And that would be from again, a local standpoint, and you can kind of apply the situation you want. But if they have a lawful authority to be there, it's a lawful arrest, and there is somebody preventing them from do that, that's a crime in Oregon for our municipal police officers. There are other things at play here, and so I guess what I was throwing a little bit when you talked about Minneapolis, you're talking about sometimes, state agencies versus federal agencies and everything else. And what I would tell you about that specifically is in Oregon, Oregon is a sanctuary state, and there are prohibitions that local law enforcement have from assisting in immigration enforcement. And so that is, in some ways, the difference that I would at least need to bring up, in answering your question, if that makes sense.
So there are times that you would ignore another officer that needs help.
It's different. It's not that I'm ignoring that officer needing help. We would still respond if it was a case of, again, safety. Again, I always will go back to what safety issue is at play. I am forbidden by law to assist, for example, with immigration enforcement. And I would pass this on to the attorney.
Okay, I'll follow up on that. Just a couple of things. There's a lot to unpack with that question. One part of it is just what are the laws, and we do have laws on obstructing an investigation, interfering with police officers. There are statutes on that. They are enforceable and would typically be enforced. A general issue with all law enforcement, and Isaiah mentioned this earlier, there's also tactics and procedures and best ways to enforce. And, are you going to arrest somebody right now, or are you going to wait till things are cooled down? There's best ways to do it. That is its own question. And that's not a lawyer question. That's really a law enforcement professional question. Those are things within their training. In terms of stuff involving different officers, when you've got different agencies, that can get complicated. Federal law is federal law. We're not going to go around and violate federal law. But at the same time, the federal government doesn't get to commandeer state and local governments either. So there's a whole federalism issue there too, separate from the sanctuary state. In terms of it's not the state police or the local police job to be the FBI or to enforce some federal laws. The federal government has its own budget and its own officers. And there's, depending on the type of enforcement, there's all kinds, like with drug stuff, you guys have joint task force. Depending on the issue, there may be different types and levels of cooperation. That gets really complicated.
Hi. I support law enforcement at every level, from our little town all the way up to federal. I love them, support them. And it pains me to know I live in a town where if some of the federal law enforcement people that I know personally and have served with were to come here on an operation supporting federal law that our United States Congress have passed. And if they were in trouble, correct me if I'm wrong, please, Chief. If they're in trouble, they could not call on you to help them. That's how I understand it. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I understand that this is a sanctuary state, and I'll just say I don't agree with that, but that is the state that I've chosen to live in. But when it comes down to brothers and sisters in arms not being able to have each other's back, wow. And that's what we are seeing in Minneapolis. And I think that could be one reason there's a nice little crowd here tonight is that what we expect here in little old Monmouth and Dallas and stuff like that. So if somebody could shed some true light on that of what we would expect, if the house next door to me is, if ICE shows up and things go south, can they call on your folks, Chief, to help them out?
What I would say to that is yes. I mean, and because I'm going to go back to it, and I will keep saying this. We're always going to respond if there is a threat of a loss of life, or safety in that way. We're going to respond, and whether it's another, of course, officer, or whether it's a resident or a citizen, we're always going to respond. As far as what they're carrying out, we're not going to assist in the, I guess, the execution of the duties, but we will respond to make sure that the scene is safe as much as it can. So I'm really not trying to dance around that. But you can expect, and I think our people, all of them, get that if there was actually, for example, a 911 call and there was a talk of loss of life or those kind of things, we're going to respond.
Okay, that's good. I mean, I understand that you're not going to join with them to go arrest an illegal criminal. I'm sorry about that, but I understand that that's our policy. But it's important for me to know that if they do get in trouble, because that's not happening everywhere. And that's why I'm asking for that assurance. Thank you so much.
So I can add the state's perspective is that anybody, law enforcement or not, that is in danger or in trouble, there is no prohibition on our law enforcement assisting. The difference is, so if somebody is in trouble, meaning their life is being threatened or there is a reasonable threat to be perceived, there is no prohibition on our police officers responding to support that. The difference is, as in the case that happened not long ago when 4 people from this community were taken away, 2 of which are citizens, they're not going to participate in the capture of those individuals or the detainment because that's a federal responsibility. But if those individuals threaten, or if somebody near them threatened, or if somebody down the block threatens, they are still duty bound by state law to respond and make sure that everybody is safe, especially the law enforcement. It's
If these 4 how do the police officers know everybody in the town and what they're hitting?
well, again, it's not the local government's job to do immigration. No, what I'm saying is ICE has their operations. They do what they do. If they're in danger, if they feel that they are in some form of danger, our folks will respond. In fact, that's the expectation, that they will respond, because it was talked about a law enforcement brother not being backed up by another law enforcement brother. That's not going to happen. The difference is they're not going to be side by side with ICE doing immigration duties. That's the difference. Well, but I mean, that, to your point, just to be clear what sanctuary status means. What? Well, signed judicial warrant opens the door for enforcement. Like, that's the other thing. Sanctuary status does not, if somebody really shouldn't be here and there's a warrant to prove they shouldn't be here, they can help. That's not what sanctuary status is about. So I just want to make sure, to your question, ma'am, there's no law enforcement, but the state of Oregon, would lose its mind if a police officer didn't help somebody who was trying to execute what they believe to be a legal warrant, if they didn't show up to help if they were in danger. That's just not going to happen. I'm not a legislator for everywhere. I'm saying the state of Oregon. Yep. There's a lot of confusion about sanctuary status, and I get it. But my word to you as the co-chair of the public safety subcommittee is if there was a law enforcement agency not making sure that they did everything they could to make the entire environment safe, there would be some explaining to do. Okay. Question. Didn't mean to jump on you, Chief.
Hi, not to change up the conversation, but I'm here more for Western Oregon. And I'm trying my best to like be unbiased, and no matter what anybody says, I want everyone to be welcome to campus, and I want them to be able to protest whatever they want. I don't care if I'd agree with it. I don't care if I don't. They should have a right to be able to protest. However, I had multiple friends that day that like were pushed. They were pushed down the stairs. There was injuries, and it kind of really frustrates me that I heard my administrators were calling Monmouth PD to respond and sort of escort this man off campus safely to help my friends, basically. And there was no response, at least to my knowledge. I don't know. I don't want to say anything like, because I just don't know.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And what I'll say is, you didn't see a physical response by way of uniformed officers on scene. But I can tell you that there was a very initial response from one of our officers who came and they consulted with Western Public Safety. And at that time, we're advised that it's handled, and things were just kind of beginning, and that they would be in touch. And I will say that from that initial incident, there was constant communication between Western Oregon University Public Safety and officers. Also, the police officers were viewing the live stream. That event happened to be live stream, and so we were viewing the live stream. We had other plainclothes officers that were driving by and observing what was happening. And so we had a pretty good view, even though we didn't have our uniformed officers on scene, of what was actually occurring. We did respond to everybody's call that called into the station and was reporting what had happened. And part of our job is we are observing, and so we are watching the live stream and to try to see, okay, do we have a crime? And what I will tell you is that at the time that we were watching, although I may not agree with everything that the individual was saying, or and I'll say that there were things that were obscene and everything else, but it was lawful in our opinion. And where the only time that I was aware ever of any contact that was made were when sidewalks were blocked, actually by from what I perceived to be students blocking the sidewalk from this person, and that actually was probably or could be an illegal activity. Now, we couldn't see everything just based on the view of the camera, but somebody has the right to pass through a sidewalk area in a public space, even if they're saying things that are hurtful or hateful to somebody else. And technically, in those instances, the people that were blocking the sidewalk would have been committing an illegal act. And somebody has the right to pass through there. We have to look at the contact. Was the contact something that was purposely done to harm a person, or were they passing through and brushing a hand off to the side? And so those are things that we're observing, and we're trying to discern by watching the videos and hearing from our other public safety partners that were on scene. But to our knowledge, I never heard of actual injuries that happened that were reported to us, and we didn't observe anything that we thought was criminal conduct that would warrant our response at the time. But I will say, up until the very end, we were actively watching what was going on, and again, trying to discern: do we go at this point, and do we have something criminal that we have to address? And we didn't up until Well, we never did until the very end.
Hi. So I want to go back to that thing of if ICE came to someone's home. What I hear is that our police force here is entrusted to keep everyone in Monmouth safe. And that doesn't matter. That matters not who they work for or where they live, whatever, is that they are to keep people safe. So if a call came in from someone in a house going, someone is at my house, I'm afraid for my life, a police officer would show up and try to ascertain really what the situation is. Would that be correct? So that if someone called and said, my door is being broken down, I'm afraid for my life, please send someone. And they say they have a warrant. I don't know if it's true. Would you come help us? Would that be fair to say that a police officer would be entrusted to be a public safety officer, irregardless of the situation? Who's safe? Who's intruding? And just try to mediate what's happening in that situation. Would that be an accurate?
Based on your description, yes.
Okay.
But I will say that there are also other things like do we know that, for example, it is an ICE operation, and they have come to do this, and somebody's afraid on the other end, but we know that it is a federal enforcement operation. There's a lot of, I guess, what ifs and variables that I can't totally speak to unless I was on scene or unless it was actively happening. But I can tell you in the instance that you gave, that somebody's banging on a door and they're saying we have a warrant, we haven't heard anything about it, and they're like, I'm afraid for my life. Yeah, we're going to respond.
Okay, that's the thing I'm concerned about for the police officers too, to go into a charged situation like that, or who knows what's flying in the air,
Yeah.
so that they could keep everyone safe. The people trying to enforce, because when people wear masks, who knows who they are? People behind the door who may not speak English, people who may speak English. It's like tensions run high. It would be incumbent on our safety officers to keep the peace and make sure of the situation so that no one would be harmed, peace could be kept, the law upheld, etc. That would be, that's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I guess I would respond. I hope you can hear me. And Chief Haynes, and again, I'm going out of my lane because I am not a trained police officer. I don't do what they do, and this is what I tell people: unless you are trained, and what you're describing happens all the time. You're describing perhaps a situation of intimate partner violence. They don't know. They go up to a car, and this happens. I always think about this with our sheriff's patrol, middle of the night, dark car. You have no idea what you've just pulled over and what you're getting into. This is the job that they make split-second decisions to ascertain what's going on, and they use their discretion, they use their training, and you hope to God they've made the right decision. I say, what 90% of the time it's right, or whatever. 2% it's an oh my God situation, but the training that you rely upon to make the right decision is what you hope for. And you have a good police department making those decisions. And to your question, they're watching the feed of what's going on there, deciding, do we go, do we not go? They're balancing all those things. They just don't say, oh, it's going down the university, let's go down there with riot gear on and break it up. They're making discrete decisions based on balancing all these things. And it's a good thing they are. I think we're all seeing things, and I don't want to stump speech you. I'll be quick. We're seeing things are happening in Minnesota, which are turning what we're used to with law enforcement on its head. It's disturbing. It's disturbing. I'm sorry I was quiet on your last question, sir, because I was processing it and absorbing it. And your question, ma'am, too. It's turning it on its head from a lot of ways. I've done close to 10. I've lost track tragically how many officer involved shootings I've processed. When I'm seeing what's happened out there and the way, I'm not talking about the rhetoric, I'm just talking about the process and the tactics of how they're investigating officer involved shootings there. It makes me troubled. That's a nice way of putting it, for all parties involved. and in terms of how we're handling law enforcement, the traditional method of dealing with tragic situations and oh my God situations, it's very concerning. And I think everyone has seen this is not what we're used to with law enforcement. And that deals with all the questions and issues you've raised here. And I've had a conversation with our U.S. attorney to say, look, I want to coordinate with you so I know what's going to happen, what we can expect, what to do, because I don't want a Monmouth police officer call me up at 3 a.m. I've got a situation here. What do I do? From the DA's perspective, not have the answer for them and not be planning this out. So we're talking about it, and they will perform their role. They will hold a scene. They will do their job as police officers. So we have talked about it. And I know there's disagreements, but they're not abdicating their job as law enforcement to deal with the situation. The things we're seeing in Minnesota are, I think, making everyone kind of question what's going on in terms of law enforcement and what we're used to seeing. And I'm not trying to editorialize. I'm just observing things and thinking how it affects my community and the folks I work with. So you can hit me with questions or on that, but that's my statement as DA. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Joe Vera. I want to thank the chief for your law enforcement. I did some everything, and you put the state law brought in 2020 since the state. I don't know what it is off the top of my head. And it was made by Representative. I came from background. I third generation, and I agree with federal. I'd be surprised to a lot of people. And I have grandfather, great grandfather, look up, there's oath of citizenship to be a citizen. And me, because I did work in the sanctuary city in San Francisco in 1993. And I was a Marine Corps recruiter. And the thing that was troubling is that it was a sanctuary city. I had to go take a proof of citizenship to INS. And there are counterfeit green cards, counterfeit documentation. Just so you know, because somebody, they are a citizen, but they might really not be. And those green cards are sold on the black market, people that claim to be lawyers. A lot of people don't know that. And that's how this young man who wanted to go into the Marine Corps, he wanted to go in since he was a little boy in this country, but he couldn't go in. And I have a thing against sanctuary states because of this. Anyways, I understand the law enforcement's hands are tied when it comes to immigration. But the thing is I hope to God that a protester doesn't stand in front of an ICE vehicle or gets in somebody's face who's in law enforcement, because that's something me growing up, I wouldn't dare do. And when I grew up, I would be even in a Marine Corps uniform being pulled over by a sheriff up in the mountains in the Sierras of California in a little sports car, claiming that there was robberies with TVs being stolen. This is in the 1980s, and I thought that was ridiculous because TVs were about this. And my car was a little Triumph Spitfire. But anyway, I do have a question. And the thing that I seen displayed where people are calling freedom of speech is when people are going into a church, a place of worship, and doing disruption. And they showed it on television of what was going on and just getting into worshipers' faces and stuff like that. You know, a worshiper and a Christian is supposed to be composed. Yes, we are. But when somebody's there and disrupting, and if we are called to 911 here, how is law enforcement going to handle that?
Based on the circumstances you gave, if we had that 911 call, and let's just say it was somebody that was a representative of the church, and they said, this is happening at our church, they're inside, we want this person trespassed, whatever the case is, we're going to respond and do that. They have the ability to do that inside, and it goes back to even the city attorney talked about that, the time, place, manner, and also just the forum that they're in. They're in a privately owned, place that they can enforce those things, and so we would respond in that case and deal with whatever we had.
The question, I guess, is for Chief. Should we, and let's put it into the local level. And you talked about the interference with egress on a sidewalk, and the same would be true with, for argument's sake, the crossing up here in front of Momiji. What would your evaluation and standards be? Should there be a protest group that is not allowing people to move up and down the sidewalk? Not a continuous loop of signs back and forth across the crosswalk impeding traffic. Sort of what's the threshold that you would take action if you would, and how would you counsel those protesters?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we get that call, we're gonna respond. And we're going to go try to talk to somebody who, is in charge or that is responsible. Maybe it's an organizer, of the event. And we're going to talk to them and say, hey, here's what you can and can't do. Here's what we're going to enforce. And we're going to try to approach it, as softly as we can, recognizing that they're there probably for, more of a First Amendment type assembly or speech. And we'll give them the opportunity to comply. And if they don't, then it would be one of those things that we're going to look at and say, okay, well, now you're going to get, kind of a warning and you need to do this. And we're going to give them very explicit, instructions on what they could do. And if they don't, then we would, potentially have to take enforcement action. And it would kind of look similar to that. But our hope is, and we do this on most of the calls that we go to, it's very rarely that we have to take an immediate action all the time. We usually have some ability to respond and whether it be de-escalate or to have a different level of tactics. There's some calls that you might have to respond and make immediate action, but usually we're going to take our time and we're going to, again, try to de-escalate, try to find a solution to the problem and deal with it that way as best we can before we actually take enforcement action.
I just had a quick one. We hear a lot of folks, maybe who are speaking out, maybe on social media or something, and they are censored by an employer or by an organization, and they say, but I have my First Amendment rights. Let's talk about who the First Amendment really covers as far as repression of rights.
Yeah, so the First Amendment and the Oregon equivalent of that, they apply against government action. They are limitations on the government. If you're having people over for a dinner party and somebody says, I really like Taylor Swift's last album, and you get up angrily and say, we don't talk that way in this house, get out now. You're allowed to do that. It's your house. You kind of with the church incident somebody brought up. That's not the government. That's a private place, and you can do that. I mean, if the person saying the really offensive things lives there, like if it's your 14-year-old daughter, then you're just stuck. In a lot of ways. But surprisingly, people do. There are some places or some things where something like a website can look like it's a public forum, but if it's genuinely a private company, it's a private company. They a club or a business, they can generally decide who their members are, who they let in, and those kinds of things. Yeah, it's the First Amendment is fundamentally a limit on government action. Part of your freedom of association is you can pick and choose who you hang out with, and you don't have to listen to people you don't want to listen to. You can go somewhere else.
There's a distinction also on government limitation, and I want to be clear about what I'm going to say and not say. Criminal activities is one thing, civil, and there are certain words and phrases that are actionable on the civil side, language that has been deemed not helpful to society, but it's not a criminal thing. And again, going back to the government piece, sometimes we think government is regulating things that they aren't. Government doesn't regulate Facebook. Government doesn't regulate those sites. Sometimes people wish they did, and sometimes wish they didn't. But it's kind of lost, especially in recent, well, in the last year especially, there's been some federal decisions about what can be said on the internet. So just aware that not everything is a criminal. Sometimes there's civil exposure.
I'm raising my hand again. I want to go back again to the people protesting in our little town at our incredibly congested one intersection. And I've been to protests in Los Angeles, which had thousands of people. I've been to protests in Eugene and Corvallis and Salem and Dallas and here. And people stay on the sidewalk and do their best to let people get past. It's their right to express themselves. And again, I want to go back to the idea that people are allowed to voice and have signs that express their opinions. If they're on a public place, people have to be able to get by, and that's on the protesters to do. So I would suggest to anyone who has an issue, I mean, there's a little guy who dresses in bright colors and leaps around saying, Jesus loves you, which I say, okay. I don't say, why guru, Jiki Khalsa to him, but it's the same thing. He has the right to do it, but he jumps into traffic and I'm worried about him, but I don't call the police. I would say if anyone, I think this is a chance for us to have dialogue with people that are protesting to let them know that you're concerned about their safety because trucks do come through that intersection. You have the right to say you're concerned about them. I've been almost driven off the road and had to remove bumper stickers. And that's frightening. I was exercising my freedom of speech and was nearly killed. So I say people can get a little heat up. I wasn't flipping anybody off when I had that bumper sticker on. It was my valid opinion. But to save my mother and my sister and myself serious bodily injury, I took it off. So I felt like that kind of violated my First Amendment rights. But I just want to go back to the fact that we can protest peacefully without hurting anybody, and that, again, our police officers are entrusted to keep everybody safe. So I feel like if I called the police to say, could you let them know what the boundaries are, I would appreciate that.
Yeah. And I will say that, that I think that we've gone over there. I mean, it's been a few years that I think that there's been a group that's assembled on, Highway 99 there at Main Street. And we've responded, a handful of times. And I think every time we've responded, we've always listened to what the complaint was, what the issue was at hand, and we would make contact with people. And we would, again, have to discern what actually was occurring, and do we have evidence of a crime or that it was unlawful in some way, shape, or form. But we rely on some of those calls to come in. I mean, we're not able to always observe everything. And so sometimes I hear that is that, these things are happening. And what I would always say is we do our best to be at these places as much as we can be, and we observe all the things that are happening. We really do rely on people to call in. If there's something that's a safety issue that we can't be there for, or we don't see, we need somebody to let us know. And then we have to go down again and see, do we have evidence of that? When we talk to people, is this actually occurring, or was it just somebody's opinion? Because usually there's, well, I know this every time, but there's always two sides to the story. And it's our job to ask those questions and to figure that out. But I would always encourage people to call in if they need to.
So, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here because it's never easy, especially in today's time, to be in a room with people that you know are going to disagree with you. Sometimes it's a little scary, sometimes it's a little uncomfortable. The fact that you're actually willing to do that, you should, if you could, give yourself a pat on the back, because that's actually how we're going to repair our democracy, where people can yell and scream and shout what they believe in, even if it's different, and later go have pizza, beer, and actually recognize that we live in a country that's pretty special. So thank you for doing that. Second thing I want to do is just to compare and contrast how folks are working through this issue at this point. How many of you were living in this town in 1968? Okay. How many of you remember the great protest against the war on this street right here? My mom was leading part of that protest. My dad was a captain on the fire department. There wasn't a lot of communication between the protesters and the city. And much to my dad's chagrin and 6 months on the couch, he was the captain who ordered the fire hoses to be used on the protesters. I'm just saying, tonight is a much better opportunity for people to come together, have some food, talk about our differences, and celebrate the fact we live in a place where we can peacefully disagree. And no one's getting water sprayed on them or arrested tonight. So it's a good thing. That's right. It's true story. True story. So thank you all for being here. If we get a round of applause for the panelists that were here, please. Mayor, do you have any comments you want to say? All right. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. And we built in some time if you want to talk and chatter in here in small groups. Plenty of food. Thank you.